Good afternoon or evening or morning to everybody who's arrived for this session. We're really thankful that you have made it. Welcome to the Human Rights and Economic Development session, one of the final sessions in the festival, and it's been a great festival so far. My name is Bandile Ngiti. I'm the project coordinator for Rethinking Economics at the Institute for Economic Justice, based in Johannesburg, South Africa. But I'm also the national coordinator for Rethinking Economics for Africa, which is a collection of local rethinking economics groups based in South African universities. I'll be the facilitator for today's session, and I will introduce the session and how things will be going along. Today's session, of course, is about human rights and economic development. How can the Global South do both? How it will go is that I'll just give a bit more framing and background to the session, and then I will give the biography of the first speaker. So just before I do that, I think the ground rules. And I'm sure many of you have been in other festival sessions. I think we'll just follow a normal panel discussion format. Each speaker will be given about 15 to 20 minutes. And then we'll have Q&A afterwards. To the participants, please make use of the chat and Q&A features. Specifically, if you've got a question, please put it in the Q&A feature to the right if you're using a laptop. And then if you don't have a question, please at least upvote the questions that you would like to hear asked. And then what will happen after the speaker presentations have been given, we will do one of two things. Once you ask your question, it'll give you an option to just continue with asking, or it'll ask if you want to ask anonymously. If you choose not to be anonymous, then that allows you to come onto screen and ask the question in your own words, because we know the Q&A feature has got a word limit, so you'll be able to come on. You'll get an invite. Once you select your question, you'll get an invite prompt on screen. You can come on screen and ask your question. Please make sure to put your mic on and your camera on if possible. If you ask anonymously, then I, as the facilitator, will just read through the question and we'll go along in that way. You can feel free to direct questions to specific speakers, but I think with a small panel like this, it's great if you ask general questions so that, we can keep the conversation moving. I will then make a decision on, when the conversation has gone along, and we will close off with an opportunity for the speakers to share what projects they're doing and how we can get in touch. So those are the ground rules. I think it's always nice if you have a pen and paper ready so you can note things down, and we can get started. So of course, the session today is on human rights and economic development. And where it comes from is this very big problem that you'd find currently in the Global South, and especially that, we as Global South rethinkers might be thinking. It's the fact that, the Global South is often referred, or used to be, and sometimes still is referred to as the developing world, and the countries that we live in are called developing countries, developing economies. But we face quite a tough balancing act because countries or developed countries in the global north where they developed, but it came at a high cost. During the Industrial Revolution, and since that time up until now, development has come at a cost. And so today's developing or emerging economies in the Global South have a tough balancing act to manage. Okay? There's a desire for them to catch up economically with the developed world, but also our global context means that there's much more of a push to for governments and for economic actors to respect human rights, to respect labor rights, to respect environmental and climate rights, to respect indigenous rights, and all these things are in tension with our development aspirations. So the speakers will be speaking broadly to this topic, and in their addresses, they'll give us a flavor of how they've understood the topic and what they'll be tackling. So I'll just introduce our first speaker, which is Aparna Gopalan. Aparna is a Ph.D. candidate in social anthropology at Harvard University, where she studies the reproduction of poverty through economic development projects in rural Western India. Her research focuses on contemporary South Asia, post-colonial development, debt-driven financialization, and capitalist inequality. So Aparna, if you could take it away.
Great, thank you. Thank you for being here to talk about the question. So like Vandili mentioned, I'm an anthropologist, a social scientist studying economic theories from the ground, from the kind of messy reality of the ethnographic present. But I want to start today's session with a kind of less social scientific, more humanistic tool in kind of approach, in talking about this question that we're addressing today and what it assumes. So basically, the question in front of us is that today's emerging economies, developing economies in the global South, is it possible for them to economically catch up with the developed world while respecting labor? So right off the bat, there's at least two that the question itself and the framing itself makes, which we can get deeper into. So the first assumption is the talk of catching up. So there's a lot in development economics and critiques to development economics that's been said about the framing of catching up. One thing it does is it assumes that the standards of living that have been reached in the developed world are not correlated with the lower standards of living in the global South. And this is a questionable assumption at best. We know that the developed world becomes the developed world across the 18th, 19th, 20th century, through colonialism, and basically through a process of accessing cheap labor, cheap resources in the developing world. So the first question that this raises for us is, who is catching up with whom and in what direction? So is it that the developing world needs to move ahead kind of in a kind of race that the global North is already ahead in, or does there need to be a process of equalization? So those who are higher up need to go down, and those who are need to go up. Is there is that kind of a better framing to talk about rather than ahead and behind? And of course, this is not to this argument or to say something like that an average person in the US is just as poor as an average person in India, but this is just to suggest that the colonial history of inequality is essential in talking about growth. So so that's kind of the first assumption. The second thing that this about how to economically catch up at the same time as respecting rights basically assumes the pursuit of growth or the pursuit of economic economic welfare is something separate from people's actual lives, human rights, from labor rights, from environmental rights. So if growth is not human rights, labor rights, environmental rights, what is growth? What is the content of growth if it's actually standing opposed to all of these things? And instead of looking at it as a balancing act between growth and rights, can we look at it as basically pursuing human rights, labor rights, environmental rights in all of the ways that are available to us, growth being perhaps one of the ways, instead of looking at it as how do we pursue growth while not trampling on these rights? So kind of like a reversal of primary goal, and which thing is taken as the caveat. And in kind of thinking about both of these questions, both of these assumptions that we're drawing out of our talk, I'm drawing on the work of theorists like the anthropologist Jason Hickel, who basically has argued the goal of economic life shouldn't be to actively increase the GDP or to grow an economy. It also shouldn't be to actively reduce the GDP. Both of those options make as little sense as each other. And the goal of economic life should be to set up societies where people thrive, where laborers have rights, where the environment is not destroyed, and growth is just a secondary consideration. So that's a kind of radical rethinking of economic that is coming out of a lot of anthropological work, a lot of other scientific work, and I'm kind of coming at this panel. But what's interesting is that even degrowth theory, so people who are basically arguing that growth should be secondary, or that we need to actually look at all the ways that growth is toxic, even degrowth theory finds it really hard to decenter growth when it comes to the global south, when it comes to poorer countries. For example, even Jason Hickel, who I just mentioned, was at a recent event about is it unfair to ask countries like India and China to reduce their carbon emissions, given that the West, countries in the West like the US and countries in Europe have already emitted many times their share of carbon and are now rich. And to this question, Jason Hickel replied that the global South, so countries like India and China, should actually get to keep emitting as much carbon as they need in order to reach the level of growth that Western countries have. Meanwhile, Western countries should emit less carbon and come down. So on the surface, this looks like a kind of a reparative argument. Basically, the countries which took more than their fair share of resources come down, and the countries which didn't come up. But there is an assumption in his answer about that in the global South, there is still an absolute scarcity of resources. So we don't actually have enough in the global South to feed, clothe, and shelter everyone, ensure everyone medical care, things like that. And so we need to grow so that we can reach that place. It's this kind of deeply I want to question in the time that remains to me. So is it really true that the global South cannot right now achieve labor rights, human rights, and instead we need to first grow so that we have enough stuff and then we can ensure these rights? And I want to argue that this is untrue. This is a fallacy. This is an assumption that we make all too easily. So to talk about this, I guess, just which is where I am from and I'm familiar with. So do we in India have enough resources to actually ensure human rights, labor rights, environmental rights, or do we actually need to have growth first? And I would say the former. We already have enough resources. And one way to know that is to look at inequality. The distributional inequality in India is staggering. It's comparable or perhaps exceeds that in the global north. So just from Shreya here is from Oxfam, and Oxfam puts out this wonderful report every year in January. And this year's report, all the following kind of data points which show the level of inequality that we're facing in India. So I'm just going to quote some facts from there. So the report found that it would take an unskilled worker 3 make what India's richest man makes in 1 second. So this factoid alone, I guess, out of all other possible contexts, should make us very suspicious of the idea that we don't have enough things, we don't have enough money, we don't have enough wealth. Other things from the report are that the increase in wealth of the richest man in India during the pandemic, just during COVID, could keep 40 crore informal workers out of poverty for at least 5 months. That's just, again, those workers, those 40 crore workers, they don't need India to have growth. They just need, for the amount that the rich one richest man we're talking about, who can, make that many livelihoods better, just by being slightly less rich. Other facts, a 4% wealth tax on the nation's 950 richest families, so really just like less than 1,000 richest families, just a 4% tax on them, which is really not a very high percentage of taxation, could raise the equivalent of 1% of India's gross domestic product, which is more than enough to vaccinate the whole country for free, on a war footing, which is what we need in India. Vaccination rates are at 6% right now, fully vaccinated. And the government is raising taxes on few people to afford vaccination. Well, you can tax these people, just 954 families, at 4%. You're going to be able to vaccinate the whole country without spending a penny. I guess these are some facts which already start to show that the argument that, at least in a country like India, we don't have what we need to give food and clothing and shelter and medicines and vaccinations, that we don't have those things, remains an absolute fallacy. And so it really raises the question of, what is growth for? If we have all of the things and we haven't distributed it properly, why is growth still the primary objective? So just to kind of even more specific examples. So within India, if you look at development outcomes, not growth, if you look at kind of which places have the best development outcomes in India, it's this Indian state called Kerala. It's in the news a lot right now, and we can talk more about that in the Q&A. But basically, this is a southwestern Indian state. 3% of the people live. The average person in this state, and it's a state in India, the state has a higher life expectancy than Black men do in the US. The average person, the educational achievement in the state is comparable. Infant mortality rates are comparable to that of South Korea, and female to male ratio is comparable to that of Western Europe. So this is kind of a standout state, and there's been a lot of scholarship analysis and criticism of what happened here. But these are just data points and factoids about a place in the global South which has achieved remarkable developmental outcomes. And then if you look at what it took for them to achieve this, it wasn't growth, or it wasn't. They've achieved these outcomes before growth came into the picture, or without pursuing growth, because this is not a rich state. If the state of Kerala was a country, it would be 50 poorest countries in the world. So we're not talking here. So we're talking about that has privileged human, environmental, and labor rights first, and then done what is necessary to achieve those things while remaining a low growth state, which is actually a problem that many have with Kerala. Just to mention it quickly, it's because it's in the news, it's trending, at least in India. Kerala, right, number of COVID cases than the rest of India, and it's being seen as a failure of this model of kind of not pursuing growth. But there's a lot of kind of analysis of this from scholars of Kerala, and they're basically arguing and showing that what has happened in Kerala is that they have actually managed to flatten the curve, which is the thing to do as of last year. Having kind of like a super high peak the way that India has, or most places in the world have, Kerala has managed to keep its case numbers steady so that its hospitals don't get overwhelmed and lives are not lost. And that's what's happened. Kerala did not run out of oxygen in the second wave in May. So this example kind of even more specifically speaks to the growth versus rights fallacy, because this is basically a place which has privileged rights, human rights, labor rights, environmental rights, and hasn't suffered for it, has seen better developmental outcomes than pretty much anywhere else in this country or in India. So I guess the kind of overall takeaway from this is there is enough in every single society, as documented by Oxfam meticulously every single year. There is enough inequality in every society that it is not growth we need right now, or it is not growth that's going to make people's lives better in the here and now. It's a redistribution. We have the resources. It's just that one man is making all of that or collecting all of that in 1 second, and the rest of us can't catch up in 3 years. So I guess it's far past time growth as the primary goal, and looking at rights as kind of secondary goals or things that constrain our growth. How much more time I have left?
About 1 or 2 minutes, please.
Okay. I guess just to wrap up and to return to talking about the pandemic for 2 minutes. So there are things that could have been done differently during the pandemic in India, in the US, and worldwide if we had this kind of different understanding of what the economy is and what growth is. So from the very beginning, centered on people's lives and said, okay, let the economy, let growth rates go to hell right now, and let's pay people to stay at home, let's pay people to develop vaccines, and let's pay people to get vaccinated. Because that's where you spend money, because that's what you value. But that's not how we saw decisions being made. The stock market was the first thing that was shored up in the US when the pandemic first hit, because the stock market plummeted, and that was the biggest crisis. It was a bigger crisis than hundreds of thousands of people dying. So I guess like nothing about this is really like, if we kind of step out of economics for a second in the spirit of rethinking it and look at it from the outside, none of this is that confusing. The pie is big enough to kind of make the pie bigger rather than redistributing it. The pie is pretty enormous. We have what we need. We just don't have the right people, don't have it, and enough people don't have it. So yeah, I guess I'll leave it at that, and I'm sure Shreya will build on the kind of more abstract level that I've talked at with more specific examples. Thank you so much.
Thank you so very much, Aparna. That was a very informative opening address. I think precisely because the thing that stuck out to me was about the situation within countries, and even how we had framed the question was to say it's global north versus global south, but the main thing you had gone on, or that you had drawn our attention to, was the situation within countries. I'm from South Africa. South Africa, I think, holds the bad record of being the most unequal country in the world. And so there's a question of, and maybe that's an interesting way to frame it, precisely because within a country, there might be better space for redistribution and political action. And but maybe let's park those for the Q&A. I will draw to your attention to two questions that have come up in the chat. But because they've got names attached to them, I think you can read them. But then after Shreya's presentation, we'll allow Kathleen, if they're willing to come and give us further explanation of their question. So I'll just introduce Shreya now, and we can keep going. Shreya Kaushik works as the Research and Knowledge Management Specialist at Fair Finance Asia, which is an Oxfam NOVIB initiative. She previously led the work on responsible finance at Oxfam India. She has over 10 years of experience, including research and advocacy on financial sector accountability and development finance institutions, the interface of business and human rights, as well as consumer protection and competition. She has worked with DFIs and government bodies in India and Sub-Saharan Africa on country-level policy strategies and reforms. She has led research and co-authored publications on diverse topics, including the status of nationally determined contributions of 4 Indian states, also on policy learnings for the new development bank, as well as policy analysis of key agriculture and transport policies in India and Sub-Saharan Africa, among others. Shreya has social issues at heart and aims to adopt a practitioner's lens to human rights discourse. Her personal motto is that discussions on problems should always accompany the discussion on solutions. That's a very nice personal motto. So Shreya, please take it away.
Thanks a lot, Bindil, for that introduction, and Thanks, Aparna, for that very good research background to what human rights and economics intersection is. Just to let people know, Wendell has already given the context of what do I do. And I come here today as a practitioner, not just in the domain of human rights, but also in the domain of political economic factors that come in various developing countries. And and I've got a presentation with me, which will kind of give you background of what we mean by when we, as practitioners and working in organizations like Oxfam, what we mean by human economy and what does that entail. Because essentially, when we talk about redistribution of wealth, when we talk about various factors where businesses are favored amongst the government and the citizens are put at the background, what are the tools by which we could probably define it at certain extent when we're talking about human economy, and what are the tools by which we could probably advocate for a better frameworks that would entail a step towards the human economy. Tom, if you could please go to the next slide. So please don't be scared by the text heavy presentation. The aim is to just give you the background of the definition. And if Rethinking Economics is intending to share the presentations, please feel free to do that with the participants. So essentially, for us who are the practitioners, what does the human economy entail? It definitely, as Aparna has touched upon, it is an equitable distribution of health and well-being. And what would essentially that mean? By the equitable distribution, we would essentially mean that we are looking at redistribution of wealth, we are looking at fairer wages, we are looking at less disparity between the countries, we are looking at better policies when we are talking about, say, trade agreements, because here is where a lot of inequalities creep in between the developed and least developing countries. The human economy should be protective of natural resources, which is extremely important. One has to understand that there is a nexus between climate change and human rights issues. There are a lot of infrastructure projects. There are a lot of big projects, such as even projects like textiles, which are set up in areas where there's a lot of environmental and health violations that are happening, and due to environmental conditions, there's a lot of migration that is happening. And essentially, in the race towards the top for these businesses, when it comes, especially in terms of economics, they just ignore all of these factors. And hence, the human economy definitely should look at natural resources in the context of climate justice. And definitely, it has to be regenerative. There is a lot of discussion now you would see going on in the various concepts like circular economy, etc., where you would see that people are talking about sustainable value chains. And here is where one has to look at these concepts in a more holistic way, that we are not just talking about better management of resources, we are also talking about fair wages, we are talking about going beyond the tier one of the value chains, and we are essentially talking about long-term capital of the businesses and not a lot of short-term gains. Tom, please, if you can go to the next slide. So why I have specifically focused on global value chains and development, because as Aparna had mentioned and alluded to the Oxfam Inequality report as well, in our work, we've identified that essentially the biggest issues in inequality creep in where the businesses are there. There is a lot of discussion you hear when we talk about the ease of doing business index that comes in through the World Bank, and there is a lot of thinking and goes behind the policies of the countries in rating higher in the ease of doing business context. And here is where you see there is a lot of push and nexus from the businesses because they are transnational corporations. They are pushing for resources at the least developing or developing countries, because essentially, if you look at the saturated markets, they are saturated not just with the products, but there are also high levels of high wage levels. There is high resource level cost, etc., and hence these are shifted towards the developing and least developing developed countries. And what we see generally happens to this nexus is essentially that at the lower level, which is, say, a country like India, say a country like Bangladesh, Cambodia, where what we see essentially is that there is a at the value-added stages at the production level, where there are low wages, there are low profit margins. But essentially, we've seen that in the past 2 decades, there has not been much improvement in terms of wages, etc. Even if they have improved, that has come at a cost of social protection at that level. Because if a worker says that they are not willing to work in a certain condition in a factory and at a certain wage, there is an easy substitution through another laborer because there's high demand for labor, and there are less jobs when it comes to more structured and skilled labor when we are talking about developing and least developing countries. But when we look at the other lens, where here is where the big businesses come in, is that they are centered essentially at protecting their intellectual property rights. This is very, very prevalent from what we see now in terms of vaccines that are being rolled out in the COVID scenario. The countries which with less resources have to end up getting, if I may use the term, a lesser effective vaccines because they cannot afford it. The countries are not ready to share the patent rights and the overall ways of developing a vaccine. And here is where you see the fight for the intellectual property rights happens, and you see these discussions happening at international forums where there is a lot of political economic factors that are in play. And here is where these discussions are where you see the trickling down effect that keeps on happening, which kind of strengthens the business narrative that there has to be a business capital, there has to be a shareholder capital increase, say in 2 years, 5 years, and 10 years, and they are not looking at the societal capital when, as far as the business transactions are concerned. Next slide, please. So essentially, what are the loopholes? I have already touched upon some, that there has been, if you look at the analysis from the economists and various development reports, that there has been an increase in the employment levels. But if you look at the data, the quality of employment data isn't there. You are not aware what is the kind of labor rights and what is the kind of protection they are getting. Essentially, if you'll see, there is always a dichotomy between worker and informal sector worker, and the companies kind of play on that loophole where the informal sector workers do not come form part of the census of the companies' balance sheets when they are reporting in the year end, because there is where they are held accountable essentially. So you'll see that there is a lot of disaggregation of data which is not available. You will not see if they are migrant workers, because that's an essential form of data. You have to know which even in a big country like India, which states are offering more employment, and is there a migration happening, because that essentially entails there are a lot of ecological as well as economic factors that lead to migration. To give you an example, in India, there's been recently 2 years back, there was a big campaign that was going on across the sugarcane supply chains, sugarcane farming, especially when it was realized that it is the state of Maharashtra is struck with severe famine, and essentially the farm laborers had to migrate to other states to do the farming, and that kind of led to abandoned villages. Led to there was an obligation for the local contractor and local businesses to kind of give them household shelter, to give them fair wages, to give them educational facilities since they were uprooting their factories. But it just ended up gross human rights violation, to the extent that females were charged because females were penalized for not coming to work because of pregnancy leaves, because of menstruation leaves, and ultimately there was an excess of doctors, there was an excess of local businessmen, businesses, mills, and contractors that were promoting the removal of womb from the females, and they were essentially being paid for it, because if they have 1 or 2 children, they don't need more. So these are the kind of cross violations that happen. And essentially why I'm talking about it here is that if a parent company, which is a transnational corporation, is a consumer of large quantities of sugar in terms of production in its value chain, and they procure from a country like India, they essentially have the responsibility to ensure that at the ground level in their value chain, there is the level of responsibility, there is a level of policies that are trickling down to the farm gate level, and it's not just limiting itself to their corporate offices or to tier 1 So these are essentially the points which acts as the turning points for in-depth inequality that keeps on creeping in these countries. Next slide, please. So I'm trying to, so just giving a segue to what responsible business is about. I had already indicated that there is a big responsibility for these businesses to ensure that they are being transparent, to ensure that they are contributing to fair wages till the ground level, to ensure that they are not employing child labor or undertaking modern slavery, because these are essentially the factors that that actually ingrains in-depth inequality within the countries and within certain sectors. We see that a lot in palm oil plantation. We see that a lot in banana plantation sectors, where there is a land grabbing happening because transnational corporations want to essentially have their farms and take away the farms from local farmers. So this has been happening a lot. So if we look at what a responsible business hierarchy looks like, it does definitely start at the fundamental responsibility level, that there is a license to operate, and they essentially follow the ground rule of doing, say, their environmental compliance, their social compliance, and that's not just at the end and not just at the start and the end of the levels that this is happening. There is also the social responsibility factor that they have to look at. And here I'm not just talking about philanthropy alone. Here I'm talking about making their business supply chains responsible. And if say, giving facilities, as I had just described, like schools and education, because essentially if a child is not going to school and going to the farm with their parents, it's translating into child labor, but by policy norms, it will not be considered so. And these things are essentially putting the idea in the heads of people who are at the lower income level ladder that this is how their lives are. But they need to be, so businesses have a responsibility to ensure that there is a proper living standard for anybody who's employed in their value chain. Then we go to a more aspirational level of enlightened responsibilities, where there is a broader discussion and approach about value creation. Here is where you're talking about shared values with the communities. You're talking about bigger discourse, and it's extremely important right now when we are talking about just transitions and net zero emissions, essentially for developing countries to match up to the developed countries in terms of their emissions. But this is something that one has to look at. What is the timeline of that emissions? If you're talking about, are you talking about if you're just talking about the net zero narrative, that there is also a catch, because essentially this is where you're allowing a country, say, which is moving towards development, which is China, which is soon becoming the economic power amongst the Asian context, and you're allowing it to emit to essentially provide the resources to its countries, like within its country, like electricity, etc. You're allowing China a pass to continue to emit, but that has to come with a framework of transitioning that to which year you're looking at, because now we are staring at climate change, which has started impacting everywhere, even in the countries which thought that they are a little away. And we see dire situations in Germany, we see dire situation in China, where there are floods, and people are essentially have to now look at the overall value creation within their investments. And then we talk about then the most aspirational level is the hybrid responsibilities, where you're looking at more inclusive value chains, you're looking at fair wages, you're looking at raising the standards of people. You are stopping, by doing so, you're trying to reduce migration so that there is less pressure on certain cities. You're trying to look at equitable resources in terms of food, etc., and when it comes to value chains. So here is where you essentially strive. And why I'm emphasizing the point of why businesses have a responsibility with this just doesn't lie with the governments alone. Yes, there are mandatory regulations that are needed to ensure this, but essentially in the long run, it is the businesses which have a nexus with the government to which certain policies are correct and certain policies are contentious.
Shreya, sorry, can I give you about 4 or 5 more minutes? Will that be enough?
No problem. Sure, okay, that would be fine. Thanks. We can go to the next slide, please. So essentially, why I am specifically now talking about and narrowing down to the financial sector is that financial sector has a big leverage in prompting businesses to turn towards better value creation by having a better environmental and social criteria and the integration. They could go beyond looking at credit ratings of these businesses and essentially look at pushing them to create more business responsibility indexes, be more transparent when they are reporting certain policies in their obligation in their annual reports. So to give you an example, if they say that do you have child labor in your value chain, and it should not be a tick box question, it should be that at this level we are reporting to say tier 1 or tier 2 of the value chain, until there we do not find any. So these are the kind of disclosures that one has to see, and we as civil society have a responsibility to kind of intervene and build capacity to a larger audience through the consumers, because consumer have great leverage when it comes to prompting businesses, because generally businesses say that this is what our consumer wants. This is they want less price and more quantity and less price. But essentially, if you ask the consumer and tell them that these are the issues that are happening at the value chain in say the sugar value chain, the tea that you are drinking, these are the issues that are essentially happening at the fair end of the value chain, and they are essentially willing to urge the businesses to be more responsible. So just the last slide, please, Tom. And essentially to let you know how all of us could be advocacy nerds, how all of us could see those red flags, is through just giving you an example. There is a link already of this article. There was a gas leak that happened in LG Polymers India Private Limited. It was a public reported event, and essentially, if you see, this plant was being funded by the LG Chem, which is a parent company based in Korea. So if you see, I'm just giving you an example to make you understand how that linkages kind of draw in when we are talking about in-depth inequality. And essentially, what happened was LGPI was expanding its businesses. The premises which was going into the residential area, it was dealing with hazardous products which was not supposed to be there so close to the civilization. And there is obviously a local government nexus where they were giving they were given they were just allowed to have weakened environmental clearances. They were post facto environmental clearances, which essentially is sadly a norm now in India. And how do you kind of see that which banks are there and then try to reach out to them and tell them that these are the issues, is that you look at their annual statements and you say that this is a high risk business. Essentially, if you do not have an environmental, social and governance lens when you are lending to these businesses, which is over and beyond the credit ratings, you essentially are into a investment risk, because this could be a stranded asset, there could be a shutdown of the plant, and that's a bad business decision. So one has to even, and the same thing essentially in the broader narrative lies for a lot when we are talking about infrastructure projects like coal, that this is an essential from fossil fuels, and we talk about just transitions now, because essentially at the end of 10 years, if there is a long-term investment that a business, that a bank or a financial institution has done to a certain business, it is going to shut down if they are not talking about transitional approaches. So essentially, if you are a advocacy nerd and you're trying to look at these businesses and figuring out what they are doing, this is the way to go about it. Why I'm just focusing this on the private sector engagement bit, because emphasizing again that this is where the policy nexus is formed. This is where, when we are talking about inequality, we talk with the governments, but the push comes from the other end. They are the ones who are kind of aligning and shaping their policies. And we should be, as a civil society, as activists, each one of us is a responsible citizen, should always strive towards business narrative and not get mesmerized by public statements like we are planting 1,000 trees and in the end you are ultimately polluting a river. So, but these essentially lead to a lot of inequality, because the businesses in the trans value chain, there is a vested interest for the least developing and developing countries to maintain the status quo. So that's and happy to deal with further topics in the Q&A.
Thank you so very much for your contribution, Shreya. I quite like the bit at the end about not being distracted by PR that says we're planting 1,000 trees. And I think one thing that often happens is, especially when you're dealing with like economics, and finance, which was what you touched on the end, people who are non-experts kind of become afraid, and they think that just because they don't know how to engage with the very technical material, they think that, well, there's nothing we can do about it. And so I think that was one point that I got. I think another point, more generally, which you've added to the discussion, actually the both of you, which as organizers we hadn't thought about, is sort of the role of business and human rights, in that usually when you think of human rights, you're thinking that it's a government that must guarantee human rights, whether through the constitution or through laws. But when you say you've got the right to housing or the right to, jobs or whatever the case might be, we usually think of the government. But I think what's come up a lot in this session, I think this is worth exploring, is the role of business and what human rights responsibilities do businesses have. So I think the Q&A can go in the following way. We've got a lot of rich material, but I would like to start with the questions that have popped up. They're on the right there. And, there's been actually quite a few. Aparna, I don't know if you've been able to read them. And I just think for time purposes, again, I like to say to speakers, there's no pressure to run through all of them. But I think what we'll do is I'll read the ones that are anonymous, and that'll give Kathleen some time to, if Kathleen so wishes, to Tom, could you invite Kathleen as a speaker, and then they'll come on. But some of the questions we've got include: do we need to push policymakers to tax the top, or is it more about fiscal policy with directed spending? So who should the question fall on? Is it the rich private sector, or is it government responsibility? There's a question on whether you think Kate Raworth's donut economics is applicable to the global south, and does it need to be adapted? There's a specific question to Shreya. The person has said they can't read it out themselves, so I'll read it for you. So to Shreya specifically, isn't it true that corporate social responsibility and responsible business is just a way for companies to clean up their image? There's a question on China and whether it fits into the definition of catching up. And yeah, I'll leave those. So Aparna, you can go first while Shreya prepares. But before you do that, Kathleen, welcome. And you can just ask your question and give any further context or comments if you need to.
Sure. The previous session I attended was on the fallacy that's inherent in GDP as being indicative of welfare. Even Simon Kuznets, who invented it virtually 100 years ago, well, nearly 90 odd, said, look, this is not the be-all, end-all. This is the beginning. And somehow it has ended up the religion. And all of us who have studied macroeconomics have known, or should have known throughout our careers, that we were only measuring and focusing on a very specific aspect of what is a much broader balance sheet, which Professor Dasgupta brought up in his magnificent report that was published earlier this year. And he is saying, look, we should not be focusing just on income flows. Kuznets said we shouldn't just be focusing on income flows. We need to look at the balance sheet. Income flows take no account of the depletion of natural capital. They don't look at the waste and damage inherent in social inequality and the unequal distribution of incomes. And I'd like to tie this in with the last question that I asked for Shreya, really. Sorry if I've got your name wrong. Shreya? Which is, your pyramid looked very much like the integrated reporting pyramid, which is kind of fundamental to the EU non-financial directive right now. And as somebody who's not only rethinking economics, but rethinking finance, which is what I've been spending my last 2 years plus doing, aren't these things all inherent? Can't India, as an example, use financial law, banking law, to change the flow of the finance and therefore promote equality, promote preservation, and meanwhile develop its own balance sheet approach to its magnificent but depleted natural capital. And that depletion started under colonialism, and why it continues to this day alarms me.
Very much, Kathleen. Thank you. Aparna, go ahead. Perhaps keeping, I think there's a number of questions. It'll be nice if it's, maybe 7 to 10 minutes, and we'll see how we go along.
Sure. So I guess to start with Kathleen's point, first of all, the point about GDP is an excellent one, and definitely baffles those of us who are not macroeconomists about how this indicator has come to take the place that it has in the discipline, but also in I guess like social political life. And I guess one answer to that is can be found in the work of anthropologists, scholars, political scientists such as Timothy Mitchell, Phil Mirowski, people who basically show the amount of work that it took to legitimize the GDP at the time at which it was invented, and the various agendas which kind of co-opted the GDP in the kind of post-war era. So that's I appreciate the point about the GDP. I think it's right that there was a session about that in this conference. So talking about a new approach, there are a lot of new approaches to kind of measuring or factoring in inequality. There's a Sustainable Development Index. Incidentally, Kerala ranks very high on that index. Cuba ranks #1. So there are other indices in place. One that I really like, I'll put this in the chat afterwards. It's actually Oxfam's Commitment to Reducing Inequality Index, which was put out in 2018. I don't know if there was another one after that, but it basically measures a government's social spending and the conditions of kind of workers in the country, as well as progressive taxation. So those are really the key pillars of making more equal societies, and that index measures those things. It's interesting because all of those things measured in that index are almost exact opposites of what is measured doing business index, which basically measures how few labor laws there are, how few tax regulations there are, and how little social spending there is. So I guess that provides us an interesting way to even create new indicators, which is basically taking up the indicators which have produced inequality and reversing them, and trying to find ways to measure the reversal. So I'll put the link in the chat for the for Oxfam's index. I think it's just a great thing, and we should, if it took the place that GDP has in political life, we would be living in a very different world. And then to the question about pushing policymakers to tax the top or fiscal policy with directed spending and investment, I guess just to the point of achievability. So which of the two is more achievable? I guess I would say the fact, again, just to return to the example I used in when I was talking, the fact that there is a state in India where people are living longer than Black men in the US is really calls into question what is achievable. politically even. So I guess I wouldn't begin by assuming that certain political struggles are doomed to fail because things change very, very fast. So just to take the example of Kerala and how did they achieve what they achieved, it was really people's very active participation in militant labor unions, in militant anti-caste struggles, which created the model that we see today. So it has long roots. Definitely took time, but created a kind of a different planet within the country of India, as the indicators speak to. And so I guess I would say that both things, taxing the top and better fiscal policy, are achievable. I think taxing the top is a moral necessity of our time, as someone put in the chat. People are flying to the moon. I don't know at what point we draw the line. I think privatizing the moon is a pretty, I would draw the line before that. So I think we have to imagine, we have to think about what kinds of political movements it's going to take to make this achievable. And I guess for the donut, someone had better responses in the chat. I'm not very familiar with the model of the donut, but I suspect what Jason Hickel has to say about it is going to be interesting to read. I haven't read it, so I won't comment on that. I don't know what other questions I'm addressing, but I'll stop there.
I'll try and keep track, but we can return to them in the next sort of round. Shreya, you can go ahead.
Sure. Thanks, Benji. And first taking up Kathleen's question, since she's asked that the model that I had shared looks more like identical to the EU banks. And yes, Kathleen, totally understand that India could be the leader, definitely in doing so. Just to tell you that how India institutes the financial sector to kind of report is through reporting guidelines called the business sustainability reporting. Their first step of intervention is to urge a private sector, financial sector included, to report on certain segregation of policies which are categorized under environmental, social, and governance criteria. Very recently, India had taken out a revised framework for the business and sustainability reporting and rechristened it as business reporting, business sustainability reporting framework, where they had given mandated the top 1,000 companies to report comprehensively to the extent that they would want to go them down to the value chains. The tricky bit is here that in terms of the financial sector, they get protected by the regulator, which is the Reserve Bank of India, where there are certain disclosures, especially if you're talking about non-performing assets, you're talking about stranded assets, which they are protected to not report, which gives us as a civil society an option to intervene and say that this is the kind of investments that you did not look at. If there is an incident like, say, the Bhopal gas tragedy, which happened and essentially the plant is shut. So if there are certain incidents and certain, because that's a publicly reported incident, so we can say that that was a bad investment decision because you did not do your ESG due diligence properly, you did not do your human rights due diligence properly, you did not do your environmental due diligence properly. But the RBI kind of protects that. Very recently, SEBI, which is the Securities and Exchange Board of India, because that's responsible for publicly disclosed reporting, that's responsible for the annual reports and financial reporting of the country, had urged the financial institutions to report the non-performing assets, but it's still not there for the standard assets. Also to tell you, when it comes to guidelines like the environmental impact assessments, the social impact assessments, we are still at a very archaic level of just conducting those in the beginning and the end of the projects, if there are big investment projects, and not an intermediary one. And they are increasingly being diluted to the extent that they are allowing post facto taking of the environmental assessment, which is essentially does not solve the purpose that the project should go ahead or not. So this is these are the kind of investment decisions that's happening. It could be the political will, definitely. It was better with the previous regime, but now this is only not taken up so actively because of the current regime in India for whatever reasons, because it's more pro-privatization. So that's a challenge that we face as a civil society, and we, through our work in fair finance, not just at the Asia level but within the countries, are aiming to do that. So I hope, Kathleen, I've been able to touch upon certain points. Taking up another question on why is it true that corporate social responsibilities and responsible business is just the way companies clean up their image? There are 2 points to it. When we are talking about corporate social responsibility, we are talking here essentially about whitewashing. We are talking about, with the example that I gave, that we are planting 1,000 trees in a protected area where we are felling the trees for our industrial purposes. When we are talking about business responsibility, we are kind of expanding the scope, because here is where we bring in the sustainable development narrative. If you look at the reportings that are happening, you'll see that most of it happens more on the philanthropic lens of it, which is the corporate social responsibility, that these are the kind of women we benefited. This is the amount of, say, schools that the children went to in the areas where our projects are running. These are the philanthropy initiatives. That's why we as a civil society more tend to lean towards the narrative of responsible business, because here is where you're talking about guidelines, voluntary or involuntary. You're talking about businesses framing their structures in a sense that is looking at fair wages, it is looking at better environment inclusion, it is looking at better norms. So there is a clear demarcation when we talk about CSR and business responsibility. That's true that in a broader sense, businesses have started talking about, with the circular economy discussions coming more actively. Here is where responsible business is being traded off and using slash circular economy. But one has to critically understand that when a whitewashing is happening, are you talking about changing of your value chain? Are you talking about changing of your production lines to promote reuse, reduce? If you're doing that, that is essentially responsible business. But if you're talking about building, if you're talking about just end use and collection at the end of, say, a waste picker, if you're talking about plastics going in the value chain, then essentially it's looking at just corporate social responsibility, because just talking about job creation at the end. So this is how you kind of flag and differentiate between these issues. I think there was another one for me. Yeah. Bendil, if I've missed out anything, I think I've answered.
I think you've answered the two that were directly for you. Sure, but I think we can, to give you a chance to look as well, we can go back to Aparna. Aparna, I think with respect to what you didn't cover, I think there was a question on tax versus fiscal policy, but also on I think your thoughts on China, and also maybe a response to your opening remarks on shouldn't we make an allowance for global South countries because they're doing this in a time period. And then before you go on, I think for Shreya, I think something that's come up might be just so you can help prepare. Maybe there's a question on kind of the work that you do with Fair Finance Asia, and maybe the linkages to specific work that you're working on and how that can be pushed forward. So just those two questions for the two of you. But Aparna, you can go.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I guess to the second two questions, which are related, so where does China fit in, and I guess what is the special allowance to be made for the global South? I think that's I think it's difficult to exactly separate to what extent poverty and deprivation in the global South is due to the influence of colonialism, and to what extent it is due to the influence of post-colonialism or things that are internal. Part of the reason it's so difficult to separate these things is because even colonialism, which is something, someone like Jason Hickel is basically saying the reason that China and India and all these other countries deserve reparations right now. They deserve reparations is because Europe took over the world for a good part of 2 centuries and exploited resources through trade, through direct occupation, through warfare, through all sorts of mechanisms. So the complicating factor in that story is that, at least in India, which is where I'm familiar with, colonialism did not happen in a bifurcated way where only white Europeans profited from poor Indian people. It was a very much a collaborative endeavor where wealthy Indian industrialists, wealthy Indian landholders were at the forefront of basically commodifying land, cheapening labor, dividing up profits. So it's difficult to think about the question in a binary way: which redistribution should happen first? Should we ask Western countries to kind of give up their carbon quotas, or should we ask India's richest man to not make as much in 1 second as someone makes in 3 years? I think that's yet another false binary. I think there needs to be reparations for colonialism, but those reparations ought not go to the wealthiest. They shouldn't be going to companies in India which then get to pollute more and get even richer and make even more money than a poor person can make in years, in seconds. So it's really both. It's really both and, I guess. I don't know if that kind of touches on both of the China question and the question about the global South. I hope it does. And to the question about fiscal policy, I guess I tried to touch on this before, but I think this is yet another case for both things. But I think that in no circumstance should we not tax the rich. We can have fiscal policy, directed spending. We can, we can talk about MMT. We can talk about all of these things. And I think none of it excuses the level of inequality, income inequality, wealth inequality that we're living with. So I don't believe in feasibility in this kind of narrow sense of, is it feasible to have reparations from Western countries, or is it feasible to have taxation within a country? I think it's both. Or we should fight for both. And again, is it feasible to have taxing the rich, or is it feasible to have a progressive fiscal policy? It's both. Capitalist kind of development and all the inequalities that have happened in the past hundreds of years never chose one or the other mechanism. They didn't say, should we cheapen labor or should we exploit nature? They did both. So to fight that, we can't be making these kind of false choices. We have to do the above and believe that it's possible, because the level of inequality we live with today should be impossible, and yet it's happening. So yeah.
Very much. Shreya, you can go ahead.
Neil, and just adding a little bit on what Aparna has already touched upon, and then getting into how we fit in other work in the Fair Finance Asia fit in. Just talking about the overall narrative of should the richer people be taxed more. That essentially brings to the more conservative idea about what the GDP is. Because if we are talking about the GDP, we are only talking about, say, the shareholder capital. That we are not talking about, say, if a business has been running in an area, the indicators are not designed such to tell you that what amount of change or what amount of impact a business might have created. And I'm not just talking about the environmental impact, I'm talking about the migration that has happened. Has the condition worsened? Has the condition gone for the better? Has the wages stayed status quo for the past 10 years, or have they stayed the same? And also bringing in the narrative around China, it is essentially also one has to understand that when we are talking about so when we are talking about emissions, we're talking in terms of net zeros, which is actually a very tricky point when we have the global narrative, because essentially we are just asking about a trade-off. So to give you an example, when a country says that we are a least developing country and we cannot shift from fossil fuels, you'll see that they are on the other hand talking about more circular economy supply chain when it comes to plastics, because plastics is essentially the raw material for fossil fuels. So here is where they kind of build that trade off. So when you're talking about countries like China, essentially how we don't ask them as a civil society or as a policymaker, even regional bodies, that okay, if you're saying that you are emitting, you're not talking about a transitioning plan. You're just saying that we will continue to emit. So this net zero emission narrative generally brings in another lens of how one is not talking about a sectoral transition, but it's just trading it off with another sector and kind of again cashing in on the trade agreements, etc., that is happening in the narrative. So just now I just come down to what we do essentially at Fair Finance Asia. And Fair Finance Asia is a network of civil societies. We are a network of over 90 civil societies, and we are running in 8 countries: Cambodia, Japan, Philippines, India, Indonesia, Pakistan, and Thailand. And we have fitted into the overall curve of Fair Finance International. What we essentially do is our work is on building financial sector responsibility and building capacity of the CSOs to undertake that advocacy within the countries. So essentially what we do that through case studies, we do that through research-based advocacy, through roundtables. We essentially do not want to go through the lens of running campaigns and telling a bank that this is essentially what you've not been doing. Our idea is to be more participative, because what we've realized when you're talking to the developing and least developed countries, they don't understand the capacity of developing a holistic sustainable matrix when they are say reporting, when they're forming their policies. So we have a methodology in our work in which we essentially we rank certain banks in the countries, which is called the Fair Finance Guide International methodology. And through that methodology, we've kind of developed a matrix which looks at various environmental, social, and governance criteria for the banks: gender, human rights, social rights, included in that index. And that index also it's a tool and not just an index that forms a tool for the financial institutions to also see, if you're talking about gender, what is the materiality of it. It is about going beyond your corporate representations in your board. So this is the kind of work that we do: build the civil society capacity, build the overall narrative, because in the countries that we work, there is a reduced capacity of among even the financial sector to look at. So we kind of go in through their business proposition, if I can use the word, is that we tell them that now the economy like
I think we are losing Shreya. Aparna, if you don't mind, could you switch your camera off? And then I'll switch mine as well to see if that helps with bandwidth.
Hello, am I audible? Hello? Hello?
Hi.
Hi, Bendil, can you hear me? Hello? Hello?
Can you hear me?
Oh, yes, I can hear you. Oh, no, I see in the chat, yes.
Okay, cool. So yeah, we're just going to switch our cameras off to help with the connection. But please continue. I think we had lost you about 2 sentences ago. So yeah.
Oh, sorry about that. So wrapping up on what I was saying, that essentially through our work, we have standardized frameworks when we're talking about reporting. We are also kind of building in financial sector capacity, not just in understanding why environmental, social, and governance criteria and additional lens is important, and also making them understand that they have the power to essentially nudge the businesses to take more sustainable business decisions. And by sustainable, I'm not talking about financial sustainability alone, but holistic in terms of the sustainable development goals of the countries as well as the financial institutions. happy to catch up with anybody who's interested to know more about the work one-to-one after the conference. Thank you so much.
I think the way we're... Sorry, I didn't try to put my camera on. Yeah, I think the way we're going is I think we've had a full number of questions, so we're not under pressure to sort of exhaust the time. I think we've had a very full conversation. I would like to ask Aparna one more question, and then I think after answering that question would then kind of wrap up after that. So Aparna, what I was interested, and I think it ties in well with what Shreya has just said about the actual work. What I was interested is that from your work, obviously as an economic anthropologist, working with development projects, what's your sense of what ordinary people feel about the issue of development, and in particular what they really want? So it need not be a political answer, but what's your, and I'm asking you a loaded question because to say ordinary people is to ask a bad question. But if you could give us a flavor of their takes on development, how they have experienced development and the question of human rights, and what insights would it be worthwhile for us to know? And then I think after that, maybe it'll work if Shreya gives us a final sort of input, in particular, maybe advice for us, in particular as rethinkers. We're university students, we're passionate about the world. What happens? So Aparna, you can decide whether you tag that to the end of this, or we'll go Shreya first and then you can close off. But yeah, just that question on your insights from economic anthropology.
Yeah, maybe I can wrap that question together with just kind of what I'm working on next and concluding remarks, and then turn it over to Shreya. So obviously any question about what ordinary people think will give me a lot of space to pick and choose, because they think all sorts of contradictory things. So I'm going to be selecting the kind of, the anthropologist is and not an objective agent, and in that vein, I'm going to be selecting like what is the flavor that I want to give you. But one thing that has remained in my mind, basically I was observing a development project, which was this very celebrated project, which was basically a concern with assetizing the poorest of the poor. So giving them assets, giving them productive assets so that they can climb out of, they called it ultra poverty. In that project, one of the first step of the project is basically doing something called a participatory wealth ranking, where you go into a particular neighborhood, in a particular really poor village, and then you survey all the residents. You gather them all, they come to a public meeting, ask them to rank one another on a scale of 1 to 6 based on who is the poorest of the poor, who is less poor, and who's doing better. So this was a very kind of interesting exercise to observe, because what I hadn't realized before observing it, and what you don't get from reading project reports, is the amount of work that it takes to convince people that these categories are real, that there are indeed some among them who are ultra poor and some among them who are just regular poor, and that people resisted this understanding for a really long time, actually. And the meeting was not the kind of smooth bureaucratic procedure that it sounds like when you read about it. People basically fought back, and not angrily, but just kind of in all these different ways. So people would just laugh and be like, what? How can I talk about poverty and wealth? Like you see us, you see our condition. What do you expect me to say? And then they'll disagree on how wealthy or poor someone. And then the project manager doesn't know what to put down, or one really interesting thing was at one point there's this really elderly woman, after about 20 minutes of kind of debate and the wealth ranking really going south, and the project kind of people who are running the project feeling worried about we're not going to get anything out of this. This really elderly woman tried to interject and say, the difference between all of us is the difference between 25 cents and 50 cents. So that's what we're talking about. And she said this as a way to say, this is not a real difference. Like, why are we discussing who's the poorest? And actually the project staff picked up on that and said, precisely, I'm trying to get you to tell me the difference between those of you who are 25 cents and those of you who are 50 cents. So he wasn't seeing the way in which it was said wasn't just to kind of give him some an example. She was basically saying this is an insignificant conversation. Why are we discussing all of us assets? He took that to be like, okay, that's exactly right. This is an insignificant difference. Now articulate the difference so that we can move on with our project. So what people really wanted, and actually one really outspoken spoke up and said that what she really wants, instead of using this money to buy just like 5 or 6 people some goats or some sewing machines or something, that the project should use the money to build the water tank, which had been in disrepair. And nobody was asking her, what should we use the money for? So it's participatory in the sense that they rank each other. But it's not participatory in the sense of like taking a pool of money, going to the village and saying, how do we use this money to help you? And I don't think development, for all it's kind of becoming participatory in the past 20 years, hasn't become participatory at the level of decision making. To make financial decisions about how to invest the money, some results might emerge. And then I guess with that, what I'm working on now or going forward is continuing to explore on these themes of trying to find kind of ways in which narratives about colonialism or the West, inequality between the West and the rest, obscure inequalities within places like India. So I'm working on public writing and kind of journalism and reporting about India's vaccine crisis and the role of private hospitals within India in basically just seriously damaging India's vaccination drive. So we can talk about the patent waivers and Pfizer and AstraZeneca, and we would be right in talking about them. But we need to talk about India's private hospitals, about India's drug manufacturers and how much profit they make. So that's kind of where what I'm working on next. Sorry, it took too long.
It's perfectly fine, and I think we. Is always looking for more information. So that's great to hear. Shreya, from your side, if you could just give us your closing remarks, in particular, how rethinkers could be more involved. You've given a great summary of the work that Fair Finance Asia does. How do people get more involved? How and what advice do you have for us as future economists?
Thanks for that, Bendil. And I think the advice I essentially have for everybody out there and listening to us is to look at a more holistic picture of when we are talking about topics like financing for development, when we are talking about topics like corporate social responsibility, when we are talking about topics like just transitions, because essentially here is where you'll see that there are diverse narratives which talk about which are just whitewashing sometimes, and which are just which have no end in sight. Very abstract when you're talking about it. So best thing is to break it down to the fact and see if you're talking about, say, moving away from certain ways of working, then what is the indicators that you're going to look at? Will it look at more inclusivity of the people who are being part of the, so giving you an example, if you're saying that there is a we are transitioning from a certain level of fossil fuel usage. Talking about this transition just in terms of businesses? Are they talking about in terms of communities? Are they talking about in terms of environment? Are they talking about in terms of biodiversity? If you're talking about just climate change, you have to broaden your narrative to climate justice and look at the literature out there in what indicators we are talking about. It should not be an abstract narrative, because we as people who are advocating for things, essentially here is where we see the red flags. What is whitewashing and what isn't? So my suggestion would be to look at more simplified, as Aparna has rightly said. Oxfam has several reports which are simplified and open for consumption for everybody. We have matrices which are out there to be used by people, because that kind of helps you to break the narrative down when you're talking about gender equality, what essentially it means. Is it just including to the floor level, or you're looking at the value chain holistically? So these are the points that one needs to look at. If you're going through a narrative, please break it down and see what are the indicators that will measure the change, that will measure the impact. So overall, that's my suggestion. And please, all of us are advocates. Please move ahead and look at advocating for the just transition in the human economy.
Thank you very much. I think we've made good time. Your sentiments on how we should take a holistic approach to everything in the economy is pretty much a great summary of the approach of rethinking economics. We favor pluralism. We favor looking at things from multiple schools of thought. So that's and I think your expertise as someone who's a practitioner has actually given a lot of extra information to our rethinkers. So thank you very much. We are at the close of our session, so I'll just give some final adverts, you could call it. Firstly, thank you very much to the speakers. Aparna and Shreya, really enjoyed your perspective. There was a request that if you got the time and the opportunity to stay behind in that other session that looks like it's a video game. It looks like The Sims. A very beautifully colored session that looks like a hall. People will be able to engage with you afterwards. Just if you could stay behind, I think there's people who would maybe want to have a bit of further discussion with you. I think when you arrive there, just remember to turn on the mic and the camera and go to any specific table. The second thing is, I think it's very nice to have met you. Part of your deep analysis of India reminded me that, we've got local groups around the world, but one of my favorite ones, as someone who's been here for a little while, has been the work being done by Rethinking Economics India. They're a new local group and they're doing a lot of things. We really hope there's further connection. So please stay in touch with the Rethinking Economics Network. But the virtual world also allows this, where you don't only have to talk to local groups in your area. So I just encourage you to please stay involved. I think the final advert is that at 6 p.m. we have the closing plenary of the festival. It's been a fantastic festival. So I think I'd encourage everyone who's here. That's in 30 minutes. So take a break, have a drink of water after chatting with guests when they could stay. And I think please go to the closing plenary. It would be a very beautiful end to what's been a really exciting and stimulating festival. So I think that's the end from me. And when I stop speaking, we'll go back into the virtual tables. But thank you very much.